say again, please?
Is John Hagan going? Or
Yes. He's doing something else, another panel.
Oh, he's doing another panel. Yeah. Because he's going to be what, president next year?
I have no idea.
No, it's the year after, isn't it?
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, no, it is. Do you know who it is
But this is
currently?
not Ayaga, this is Ayaga.
Oh, yeah, of
So we
course.
can't
Sorry, I'm
be
getting
regulatory.
confused. It is the IRGO that
Yes,
he's
the
doing, yeah.
regulators. Ayaga will be in San Francisco next year.
Oh, very nice. Like that a lot.
Yeah, in a very nice Ritz-Carlton hotel.
Even better. It's absolutely beautiful there, the Ritz-Carlton.
It is, it is.
It's the one that's the old bank, isn't it? It's like this wonderful Grecian column at the top of the hill.
I'm sorry to see you much last night. You disappeared.
Well, we
It
went
was
to a
either
jazz
an
club
Arsenal
and then
military
to
academy
a
or a
bar,
bank.
and then
Stunning.
Right.
It says the Ritz-Carlton is San
Little
Francisco.
magical.
But the Ritz-Carlton is always good. I stayed
which
one
was
night
very
at the
nice.
Ritz-Carlton Marina Bay. It's called.
Yes, that's in LA, isn't it? Yeah.
And in LA, yes.
Yeah.
Mix it up.
But that's a new build, isn't it?
Did you get the pictures on email?
Yes.
Okay.
It's all rubbish. Don't ask this
Yes,
stupid question.
exactly.
Of course it's rubbish.
People in the front.
Oh, the good looking.
Yeah, exactly.
No beer? But what is this? No beer?
Okay, well, welcome back to the third session this morning. I'm in a different role. I'm now the chairing a panel, and we're going to be talking about gambling sector both now and in the future. And it's not just because the people in this panel have been around for such a long time that they can talk about the future. It's that they have all the expertise required to talk about it in respect to their respective regions. We've heard in the course of the conference a lot of people talk about specific issues affecting their markets. We will be covering some of those in the course of this panel. But we're also going to be covering other areas which haven't been talked about. So first of all, let me just introduce the panel, many of whom will be known to you, but I think we've also, I think for the first time at IMGL, have a representative from Africa on the panel, and certainly from Nigeria. And so I'm delighted to welcome to the panel Yahaya Bakori from Nigeria. Thank you very much. But beside him on the right, we have Jörg Hoffmann, past president of IMGL. On my immediate right, we have Hilary Stewart-Jones, known to many of you, now wearing a different hat from Harris Hagen. So great for you to be here today, Hilary. And last of all, we have Kok Heng Lau from Singapore. Don't just look at us as representing our particular countries. Look at the people representing the region. This will be in two parts. First of all, each of the panelists will be talking about 2018 and what it means for the gambling sector in the particular country, and at least for Kok Heng and also for Yahaya, talking about their region. And then we're going to discuss a number of themes by which we're going to look at issues that occur in the future. There will probably be some overlap for what we've talked about beforehand, but we will also be going on various other aspects, which will be a good segue into some of the discussion panels this afternoon. So first of all, I'd like to ask Yahaya to talk about Nigeria, Africa, and I think it's really important for us to understand, initially, to be blunt, how is gambling regulated in Nigeria? And let's go from there. Thank you, Yahaya.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So a bit about Nigeria. Nigeria is the most populous African country with almost 200 million people. It's projected that in the next 15 years, population will exceed that of the US. So just a bit of background on regulation in Nigeria particularly. In the 60s, 70s, it was more about casinos. Casinos were huge in the 60s, 70s. And of course, a bit of pool. Pool is still relevant in Nigeria up to now. But those were the premises under which the regulations were passed then. As far back as 1964, they had a casino tax regulation for Lagos State, which is the capital and the commercial city of Nigeria. Then in 2007, so okay, in 1977, the military government then banned casinos. Again, it was because of addiction, abuse, and poor regulation. So 1977, they banned the importation of slot machines. Nothing happened in that space up until 2007, when the National Lottery Regulatory Law was passed. Again, but that was passed specifically to run a national lottery. It was actually a favor to one of the president's friends. So the law was meant to have a single lottery operator, but after that regime passed, the Attorney General gave a different legal opinion, saying that law could apply to different licensees. So we have the National Lottery now, and they're about to restructure everything. They're going to review the law, or they have reviewed the law. There are a couple of regulations that are about to be passed. But just to add that Nigeria has 30 states, and based on the Constitution of Nigeria, those 30 states can all regulate gambling in their respectively. So there's been a battle between who has the ultimate control on regulation in Nigeria. Is it the states or is it the national? So if, like I gave you a background earlier on, the national lottery was meant to be a national lottery for the whole country, which has now changed into being the regulation for the whole country. So you find out that most operators, when they come to Nigeria, as exciting as the market looks, they are confused about how to go about it. Of course, many operators have been able to circumvent that, but so that's where we are right now. Ultimately, what I think is going to happen, which is what I've advised, because I'm also involved with that whole restructuring process, is that there has to be some kind of a give and take between the states and the government, especially when it comes to online or remote gaming. A panel has been constituted now between the states. All of them are working, negotiating to see how they can resolve that anomaly. Yeah.
Now, Yahya, I think you have opened a window that many of us were not previously aware about, Nigeria being a federal system,
Yes.
which gives rise to a number of the complexities that people in Europe have to deal with, that in the US that they'll have to deal with, and certainly in Australia. Has there been any instance where there has been actually conflict between the federal regulation and the states involving the gambling sector, or is that something we're looking forward to?
Oh yeah, there are lots. Incidentally, the most aggressive regulator in Nigeria is Lagos State. Lagos State is a revenue-driven government, and they took advantage of that right from 2004. They had the first proper law in Nigeria. And so what they did in trying to enforce the constitutional provisions was to stop any national licensees. So what happened was that once the Attorney General gave a legal opinion advising that other people could be licensed to provide the same service, several got those licenses and tried to operate in Lagos. Now Lagos alone is 22 million people. And like I mentioned, is the fourth biggest economy in the whole of Africa, just Lagos on its own. So what Lagos State CEO did was to basically enforce and to stop national licensees from operating at the state level. They even took that case to court, and there was some kind of ruling then saying if it's intercommerce, if it has to do with intercommerce, that is interstate commerce, then national should regulate that. You know. So that was the case, that's where it stopped. Lagos State never actually appealed that, but we have had also a very recent case whereby a national lottery licensee as well still took Lagos State to court, and the court ruled in favor of the licensee, you know, and Lagos State now has now appealed that, so waiting for the outcome of that.
Thank you, Yahya, and I think there's one thing which you mentioned to me yesterday, and it's very relevant to your comment in connection with online remote gambling, and we'll be talking about that a bit later. Could you just, for the benefit of the audience, just indicate the prevalence of mobile phones which are held by Nigerians?
Okay, yeah. So I saw a recent report that says Nigeria is the most mobilized country in the world. There are 131 million mobile phones. So that in itself creates a different discussion entirely. But then culturally, we are not used to trading or to transacting with our phones. You know, we make calls, but unlike Kenya, so Kenya is a much more active mobile commercial market. So you see that the figures in Kenya is bigger than Nigeria. But then, of course, part of what the government is doing is to use the mobile industry as part of the financial inclusion strategy. You know. So yes, it's a big market. Even the banks now have started creating products that cater to the mobile subscribers. So more and more of the business is going towards mobile, the mobile business.
Okay. Thank you. Now, Kok Keng to really talk about 2018 for the gambling sector and a perspective from Asia. So thank you, Kok Keng.
Okay, whenever somebody asks me to talk about gambling in Asia, it's a very loaded question. In my last conference, when somebody asked me to describe the Asian gambling industry, what it was like, so my answer was, in terms of the demand, Asia is infested with gamblers. In terms of regulation, it's 50 shades of grey. It ranges from licensed jurisdictions in the Philippines to prohibited jurisdictions in most parts of Asia to those which are somewhere in between, semi-regulated or totally either unregulated or ambiguous. I come from Singapore, and it was only 4 years ago that we had our Remote Gambling Act passed. And before that, we inherited two major pieces of legislation from the British. One was the Betting Act, and the other one was the Common Gaming Houses Act. Now, between the two acts and the passing of the Remote Gambling Act, we of course welcome two casinos into Singapore. And the relevance of these two casinos can now be seen in terms of increased vibrancy to our economy, something which the Japanese are trying to model their integrated resorts model after. We may well end up being a victim of our own success because our integrated resorts or our two casinos have been so successful in terms of not just bring in revenue, but also responsible gaming and gaming integrity, that many other countries in Asia are now trying to follow our model, Japan being one of them, Vietnam being another, and Taiwan is the third one that I know of. Now, in terms of what's happening in the region, of course, you've heard from our Japanese member yesterday that Japan has passed laws to legalize casino gambling. They actually passed 3 laws over a span of 2 years. The first law was to basically legalize private sector casino gambling. The second law was to put in place measures to deal with gambling addiction. And I think in Japan, 5% of the population are considered to be gaming addicts. It's not just pachinko addiction, but also online gambling. The third bill was really to put into place all of these details about the operation of the integrated resorts. So that would include putting safeguards and implementing casino entry levies, same as what Singapore has done. If you're a foreigner, you don't have to pay anything when you enter the casinos. But if you are a Singapore resident or a Singapore citizen, it's an entry levy of about equivalent of US $75 per 24 hours. Japan is proposing a levy entry of about maybe $45 US per entry. Similarly, Vietnam has got $43 US entry levy for locals. So that's what's happening in Japan. I think that it's going to be a very exciting time, for Japan, and after the distractions of the Tokyo Olympics are all over, I think you can expect the government to then call for bidders for the integrated resorts, the same thing as we did in Singapore. In terms of the timeline, if the Singapore experience is anything to go by, from the time we made a decision to allow legalized casino gambling until the time the first casino opened its doors, it was, to be precise, 4 years and 10 months. So if the Japanese were going to go on the same timeline, then you probably expect the first casinos to open in Japan in probably the mid 2020s. It's something that's really captured the attention of operators, big operators, and the leading front runners, or what they would have professed to be themselves, include Genting Singapore, the people that run Resorts World Sentosa, one of the 2 casinos in Singapore. They have set up 5 subsidiary companies in Japan just to prepare for the bidding. We've got Galaxy Entertainment, the big casino in Macau, offer training programs and scholarships for Japanese university students to be trained in Macau on the management of integrated resorts. We've got Sands and MGM each committing to investment of $10 billion in the building of casinos in Japan. So very, very exciting times ahead in Japan. And if our Singapore experience is anything to go by, you can expect lots of regulatory structures to be put in place, including the setting up of National Problem Gambling Commission to deal with problem gambling, to deal with self-exclusion measures, and also a casino crimes unit to deal with crimes that are committed in the casino industry. In Vietnam, there are some developments also which could potentially be of interest. The first is that the Vietnamese government, sometime in 2017, decided that it wasn't going to lose out in terms of gaming revenue to its neighboring countries, because although there are casinos in Vietnam, these casinos are only open to foreigners, and the locals cannot go into these casinos. So what the locals did was to go to neighboring countries like Cambodia for their fix. So the Vietnamese government has decided now to allow 2 casinos to be open to locals, but with the usual safeguards of imposing requirements on the operators to establish the identities of the casino patrons, to also monitor how much they spend in terms of dollars and also in terms of time. And the operators are required to actually record the winnings of these people, and the time they enter the casino, the time they leave the casino, and forget about data privacy in Vietnam, because all of this information is accessible to the government if they call for such information. The other notable development in Vietnam is that they finally allowed for legalized sports betting to take place. Now, this has been a very, very long-standing initiative, because I remember probably about 10, 12 years ago, there was a delegation from the Vietnamese Ministry of Economic Affairs, together with the officials from the Vietnam Football Federation, who came to visit Singapore, and I was at that meeting. And they were trying to learn about how Singapore regulated sports betting. Now, it's taken more than 10 years for them. They've passed laws, but unfortunately, I think they went a little bit over the top. They imposed licensing restrictions which were extremely onerous. So firstly, they wanted the operator to be local. Secondly, they wanted the upfront commitment to be a whopping $45 million. And thirdly, they restricted the number of events for which legalized sports betting could be offered to just the World Cup, the Asian Games and the Southeast Asian Games. And they excluded from that scope any matches which the Vietnamese team is playing. So that basically meant that there were no takers. So although the license is available, no one has applied for it. So they've realized that, and they've passed a law to now expand the scope of events for which sports bets can be offered. But they miss a boat because they did not take advantage of the recent World Cup, and the law is only going to take effect on the 1st of January in 2019. So finally, just to round up the scene in Singapore, we've got this wonderful skyline of Singapore now, which is defined by the 3 towers of Marina Bay Sands. It's so popular that the filmmakers of Crazy Rich Asians decided to choose Singapore to be the venue for the film. Same thing could happen in Japan in about 5 years' time. But there was one anomaly that was always present in Singapore, and that is the regulation of private lottery clubs. So by these I mean clubs which are social recreational clubs or sports clubs that are allowed to have slot machines in the clubhouse as a means of raising revenue to subsidize their other operations so that they can provide the food at a discounted price, and for the football club to fund the football club's operations. So for many, many years, the regulator, or rather, the Ministry of Home Affairs that functioned as a de facto regulator, did not really bother about the activities of the slot machine clubs. So what the only requirement is that you've got to be firstly a registered society. You've got to have 500 members, and your slot machines must of course be cleared by the authorities. There's an approval process, and the clubs must have at least 2 other recreational facilities in addition to the slot machines. So, in other words, what the ministry had in mind was, okay, in addition to your slot machines, you have a karaoke room, you've got a billiards table, or you've got a spa, a sauna, or a swimming pool. But the way the clubs interpreted this 2 additional recreational facilities requirement was to have a dartboard on a wall and to have a foosball table or a carom board, right? And the rest of the space in the clubhouse was dedicated to slot machines. So, in other words, what you had essentially was a plethora of mini casinos sprouting all around the island, which possibly in competition with the 2 IRs, but with one big advantage. They don't have to impose that levy of $100 Singapore dollars onto people who went into the club. So all of this was left, untouched for many years. But there was one trigger event that happened in 2017, something which, an event which I personally was involved in, peripherally. But let's not go into the details. Suffice to say, it was in the context of the elections to the Council of the Football Association of Singapore. And as it turned out, one of the football clubs, whose chairman was running for the presidency, had emerged as the most lucrative slot machine club in Singapore, raking in something like $36 million a year, which was something even, sorry? Yeah, something which was something which exceeded the entire budget of the Football Association. So the authorities then began to look into the phenomena of slot machine clubs in Singapore, and then they decided that these clubs ought to be regulated the same way as the casinos. In other words, you've got not entry levies, but you've got to impose advertising restrictions on them. You got to impose self-exclusion schemes on them. Their operating hours should be limited to 10 to 11 p.m. instead of 24 hours. And they've got to deny entry to people who are not members. So, you know, existing members cannot bring in their friends. So all of that has only recently been put in place, and that has resulted from a total of about 90 of these slot machine clubs to a current number of 42. So it's a huge, drastic reduction. But that's what's happening in Singapore. So in brief, these are some of the things that are happening in our backyard. I think that the environment is a very fluid one, and you can expect more to happen over the next 24 months.
Thanks, Kok Heng. I know you've only just touched the surface of what's happening in Asia. Yeah, we've just heard from Singapore and Kok Heng about how ordered things are. Perhaps you can now just give us insight into the chaos that is Germany. But let's just keep it a couple of minutes.
Yeah, Jimmy, frankly, I would rather give a presentation on German engineering, on car manufacturing and things like this. We have reason to probably say made in Germany not too bad, but if it comes to gaming regulation, there's no reason to be proud about my country and regulation in my jurisdiction. So 2018, what is this? What does it mean for the regulation in Germany? Fortunately, the year is not over, so some things can happen. I can tell you that many things happened in Germany, but not really changed a lot with respect to regulation. The beginning of the year was quite strange and quite unusual because at the end of last year, or it's better say in October, there was a decision delivered by the Federal Administrative Court in Germany, which is the highest administrative court, saying that the total internet ban on online gaming is in line with constitutional law, which is our basic law, and with higher ranking European Union law. My personal opinion is this decision is completely wrong. It's just political, but it causes a lot of trouble and nervosity in the industry. Some major players dropped off the German market, at least B2B business, and did not allow any longer to use their software by companies targeting customers in Germany. And everybody was looking on the regulatory side and the enforcement side, asking what will happen. It was quite quiet in the following months, and this decision has been appealed. It's now with the German Federal Constitutional Court. We're waiting for a decision. Hopefully it will take time until this decision will be delivered, because in the meantime you see some different approaches on the political level that things needed to be changed. One of the reasons why there is certain pressure on regulation is that our interstate treaty, which is the legal framework for gaming regulation, provides a clause which we call the experimental clause. It's an old one that allowed the regulator to issue licenses based on a license tender up to a maximum of 20 sports betting operators. As many of you know, this license application failed. It collapsed completely in litigation, and none of these licenses have ever been granted to any operators. But this experimental clause was limited to 7 years and will be over next year, which means theoretically, under formal and written law, we would go back to the monopoly in Germany, because sports betting would then only be allowed to be provided by a state-owned company and only retail for the time being. And this is something which is not acceptable. The market is very, very, very solid in Germany, very stable. And finally, it's important to know that last year, the prime ministers in 2016 tried, with 16 prime ministers, tried to do some minimal amendments to the existing interstate treaty, since this has been criticized by the European Court of Justice. But surprisingly, by the end of last year, there were 3 states, namely Schleswig-Holstein, Hesse, and North Rhine-Westphalia, who not ratified these interstate treaty amendments. And so, since they need the votes, the votes of all prime ministers, they could not set this amended interstate treaty into force. And so we have still the pressure. The current interstate treaty with respect to sports betting is regarded by the European Court of Justice as being unlawful, at least, and not to be justified restriction of the freedom of services, as long as this de facto monopoly applies in Germany. So what's next? Prime ministers have a meeting in October. Before that, in September 13, the state chancellors will meet to prepare this meeting. Gaming will be on the agenda. some come with great expectation and think perhaps they can find a way to make a compromise. My personal expectation is they will postpone that matter, but very soon sit together and make a decision. And you cannot predict this decision. A way that is possible and likely to find that compromise could be that they sign a new treaty, or at least decide on drafting a new treaty, where these three lenders and hopefully others too have the chance to opt out, to regulate online casino games, whereas the others could opt out and say, no, we don't want it. So we would have different level of regulation in Germany. Could be an issue of coherence, but it's at least an option which could open the door for a better regulation. And you find regulators and politicians being more and more open-minded to discuss regulation in Germany. Last information in Germany, which is timely, is that we had one land in Schleswig-Holstein, which is Schleswig-Holstein, in Germany, which is Schleswig-Holstein again. They introduced their own gaming act in 2012. They issued a lot of licenses, up to 50 licenses, to operators for online casinos and sports betting, and these licenses expire this year. The sports betting licenses, the first ones expired in May, I think, April, May, and the first casino licenses are about to expire, I think, in November or December this year. And they cannot be extended because this law has been repealed, has been revoked by, due to a change of government 1 year after it came into force. And now they established a new regime which is something between licensing and toleration. They call it transitional regulation, and operators can apply for a license, not for a license, but for a written confirmation, a document which is like an administrative act, very close to a license, which confirms the legality of the operations of that particular operator in Schleswig-Holstein. This applies for sports betting for the time being, and hopefully if they manage to do that for casino games as well. New is that it's not just limited to existing operators who are operating under license there, but for everyone who meets the requirements. And that is interesting for those who want to get the comfort level of maximum compliance in Germany, making reference to the European Court of Justice decision INSE, which allows sports betting operator basically to be tolerated in Germany, and to new requirements provided by the Federal Administrative Court that you have to show your willingness and eligibility to operate legally and compliant in Germany, which you can only do if you have participated in an application tender somewhere. And this is maybe is a new option to combine these requirements and be compliant. So this is it for Germany. That's why I say the year is not over. Stay tuned. Something will happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Jürgen. That's the second illustration of a federal system within a country, which is certainly causing a lot of issues. Just to give an example from a recent development in Australia, which is slightly novel in respect to the advertising controls. We've heard about what the ban in Italy that's coming into effect. In one state, they essentially, the relationship with the licensed wagering operators has fallen down to such an extent that the regulator doesn't trust them. It doesn't trust them in respect of the fact that there have been various prosecutions, 17 or so that have been brought, that they've been successful against providing inducements to people in New South Wales, which is prohibited. The advertisements have on them, not for people in New South Wales, but still they were provided. So they've introduced a law to say that any advertising which is capable of being viewed by a resident in New South Wales must not, there must not be any inducements. You can still have advertising, but you can't have any inducements and it's visible. It's not sufficient to put a disclaimer in, and it's a... And you may think that this isn't this fodder for lawyers like us, and I'm sure Hilary will put up her hand straight away on this. But it's the fact is under the Australian system, you're essentially guilty until you prove yourself innocent. Is it worth the issue? And that's always very difficult with a grey law. But the reason why I've mentioned that particular point is that this precedent is very likely to be followed by other states as another means to essentially put up barriers between states which be imposed on the advertisers, electronic or otherwise, such that they are going to be need to be the policeman for the wagering operators. I'm now going to ask Hilary to talk to both the current position, as a topic we haven't talked about much now, and also how she anticipates the impact of Brexit may affect gambling sector. Hilary.
Thanks very much. I suppose it's, just dealing with Brexit, first of all, it's probably one of the questions that I've been asked most frequently over the course of the last 2 years, apart from obviously continuing to apologise for the enormous mess the British government has landed itself in. In terms of the industry, quite a few journalists have tried to make an article out of it, but there's not really very much to say because from an online perspective, when we moved to the point of consumption methodology of licensing in 2014, that required most online operators to get a license in the UK. And they normally combine that with other licenses. So insofar as there's still a TFEU freedom to supply flag to be flown anywhere in the world, the online operators have actually got that position already covered. So there's only a little bit of a ripple effect that may impact the online industry from a consumer protection perspective, data protection regulations, and other laws that impact upon supplies generally. So there's not going to be too much difference, pre-Brexit and post-Brexit, whatever Brexit now looks like. The bricks and mortar industry may have a little bit of a ripple impact because obviously it will impact on people's ability to travel in and out of the UK. And certainly when we changed the law in 2007 and we allowed junket operators to actually freely move people in planes literally into the UK, that had an enormous boom impact upon certainly the London casinos, and they are finding the position, trading position challenging anyway, and if they're going to be told that half their players can't come and play anymore, that will have a severe impact. So no change there. We continue with with the embarrassment factor, as I said, in terms of what the British government have done. But I suppose I don't want to repeat too much of what has already been said today about where the industry and the regulator is in the UK, because as you've all heard, it's all pretty much doom and gloom, really. But from a regulator's perspective, Steve mentioned this morning, the idea is that they're going to be tough regulators, they're going to come down on people, they're not going to give people the chance to explain, they're not going to certainly give people the amnesty that was previously existing within the if you went to the regulator and said mea culpa, that generally meant that you were in sufficiently good odour and not to actually face a whopping fine. That position no longer prevails, which is very disturbing because you have a regulator that is quite reliant on the industry to explain things to it. And that means that as you've created that divide, you've created a mistrust which actually only augurs badly ultimately for the regulator because they simply won't understand technology developments and so on. Now, looking at it from that perspective, I would be critical of our regulator for going down too far down that route. But also, I think it's probably fair to say that the industry needs to be a little bit criticised as well because it has been so complacent about compliance, and it remains pretty complacent. Jamie and I were talking about this earlier on, weren't we, in the sense that one of the first, if we ever do a kind of like an audit review of people's compliance, one of the first questions I normally ask is how much you pay your compliance officer. And if the answer to that is like a lamentably low sum, they clearly aren't taking compliance seriously enough. And that creates a real problem because if you don't elevate a compliance role sufficiently within the organisation, executives don't take compliance seriously enough. If you're not paying them enough, you're not going to be attracting the calibre of individuals that you need to have stand up at sea level and say, no, you can't do it. And you'd be amazed of I'm sure all the UK lawyers would be on the same page with me here. You're amazed sometimes as to what's happened in organisations and the compliance officer doesn't even know what's gone on. Advertising has not passed through them. And, we've all seen the big fines and the systemic failures that are being allowed to happen in the online industry, particularly where the operators have said, the dark ops, which are the affiliate operators, we've no idea how they do it, but we're just so pleased because the customers keep on coming back. So that complacency has to change. I think complacency around products need to change as well. And I'm sure all of you are aware that, the table gaming industry, certainly in Europe, is now decimated. I've got clients that are giving away their table games for free because they can't get the revenues they used to have. The product, as we all know, was very staid. There were no differentiators. We've talked about gamification earlier on today. There is going to be scope for different product ultimately. But what it has proven, in terms of this regulatory creep is that it's harder and harder for operators to make the margins that they used to. And very worryingly, recently when I was at a conference, the prediction that everyone made on the panel is this is going to increase ultimately the illegal market because you're making it simply too difficult for people to comply with all of these standards, and you're punishing them too wholeheartedly when they do slip up, as they invariably will. So there's got to be a rethink, I think, in terms of operators' approach to compliance, but it's also coupling that with a different approach to their product as well, because it's going to be harder and harder to make the monies that they previously had made. And all I would say to you as well is that I know that there's been a huge focus on source of wealth and ensuring that people have sustainable wealth to maintain the levels of gambling that they do. People still gamble an astonishing amount of money if you look at it relative to their wealth. Simply because you're a company executive doesn't mean that you can blow 40 grand in an afternoon. Hardly anybody has got that kind of sustainable income unless they're kind of like the complete high rollers that go to casinos. And as consumers get a little bit more savvy and they keep pushing back on things like data subject access requests, it will be very embarrassing for the average operator to have all of those emails exchanged about, great, he's losing again. And we've seen it in a sense that it's a total rethink about how they protect consumers as well, that needs to be put in the heart of a very, very strong compliance team within all of these companies.
Well, Hilary, that's covered a lot of points. And I'd probably ask Jörg first of all, then Hayo, talk about, is the gambling law really, in your country, fit for purpose? Is this recognised by regulators, and are they going to change it to address some of these issues, both coming from new technologies and the fact that it is not suitable itself to protect consumers? So.
Yes. Well, as I said, it's the interstate treaty, and there are some other laws that apply, and this is old law, and it's created by a generation of lawmakers who have not arrived in this century because it's not really tailored to customize the online space at all. Regulators apply that law, they have to apply, they cannot even question it in public, and they are not lawmakers. They may have some influence. Our problem is we have 16 parliaments being in charge for gambling regulation, and those prime ministers, depending which party they belong to, have a certain attitude regarding gambling, and so changes are not really to be expected on this political level if it comes to discussion. Most importantly, of course, the whole thing is designed to combat gaming addiction. This has a specific reason. In 2006, we had a constitutional court decision about the back then existing state monopoly on sports betting and lotteries, and the court says the way the state-owned operators run the business is the same way like private operators would do, generating as much as traffic and revenues, advertising very aggressively. So under these circumstances, a monopoly, which is a restriction of the freedom of services with respect also to European Union law, cannot be justified. So in that minute, the state decided, okay, from now on, we create a new law. We draft a preamble saying this is to protect players and to fight gaming addiction. There's no other excuse. You cannot justify regulation and restrictions with fighting fraud or getting more taxation. It's not accepted by the court. So it is weird if you realize that a total internet ban applicable to online casinos means it is prohibition. So the ideal world in the mind of a lawmaker would be it's prohibited, then it's not there. We all know it's a massive market. Millions of Germans play with millions of euros every day and every night. So if they want to protect, this is a complete failure. There's no protection at all because there's no supervision, there's no proper enforcement. They start to realize this, and there are some voices among regulators, and specifically in Schleswig-Holstein, because they have the experience saying this is the wrong way. The only problem we have in Germany is that if you lead this discussion and discuss gaming addiction, the lottery operators in Germany, which are monopolists, all lottery operators in Germany, at least those who got licenses, are owned by the lenders, state-owned. They started this discussion 10 years ago saying, well, we cannot allow online casinos because this is regarded to be very addictive, like slot machines. Maybe there's no evidence, but this is what they think. So if you regulate casinos and issue licenses, how can we justify that lotteries are not subject to privatization and to regulation? Meanwhile, things are different, but I think it's just a progress to be made. And I mentioned the European Union, perhaps because it's in the brochure when we address this panel. If I imagine there would be no European Union and no freedom of services, Germany would be a disastrous desert of regulation because they could do what they want. There's no control. The German courts fail in protecting players because they don't understand the market. Now the EU Commission announced last year in December to stay away from further or future infringement proceedings regarding member states, against member states with respect to gaming regulation. A disastrous announcement, of course, and I cannot justify how this could be reasoned, but there's still one control instance, that's the European Court of Justice, and whenever jurisprudence fails, there's last hope that this resort could be actively controlling and correcting developments which are not really in the interest of the industry and in the interest of the players.
Yeah, hi. Do you want to talk about fitness for purpose of the Nigerian game?
Yeah, okay. So when it comes to, you have raised issues on consumer protection, responsible gambling, which is a big issue here. I think apart from even just aside from Nigeria and the most of Africa, those are still not issues that have been confronted. Though we have seen reactions from the legislators. If you look at in Kenya, they increased the taxes to 35% of GGR, and that was in reaction to the amount of unbridled gambling going on in that in Kenya. Same applies for Uganda. So across Africa, most of the countries I'm in touch with, I know that they haven't addressed those key issues. The most recent law that is worth commending is that of Botswana. Botswana is a small country near South Africa. Their law is just 2 years old, and I know they've issued an EOI on how to really manage issues of consumption, consumer protection, responsible gambling, and all those other related issues. So we have to understand that, first of all, this industry in Africa is, for most countries, is not even seen as an industry yet. It's just it's like some kind of nuisance taking place, and then the best thing we can do is to make the most we can make out of it. Of course, recently the secretary to the state government, to Nigerian government, said they were going to make lottery revenue earner for the government. Of course, that remains to be seen what he intends to do with that. But if you go to most of the East African countries, even Zambia, Zimbabwe, is unbridled. There's nothing to protect the customers. In South Africa, I know that online gaming is illegal, it's banned or illegal, I'm not sure what to call it. Zimbabwe as well. While all of that takes place, the regulators have really taken no position or taken any action in that direction. Again, I think it's really the issue of capacity. You have lots of square pegs and round holes. Many people who are there based on political considerations more than their understanding of the industry.
Thanks. We're coming close to our time, so do you have any questions about the topics we've covered so far from the floor? One right up the back.
It was established even before the casinos were built. So basically, the police set up this special unit to tackle crimes relating to loan sharking, money lending, money laundering, and prostitution. So these are the crimes that are traditionally associated with casino gambling. The police officers were sent for training to Vegas, Macau, when they came back, they were ready to form that casino crimes unit. And the day the casino opened, they were already out trying to detect crimes. And I think someone was eventually prosecuted for a crime that was committed on the day the casino was open. Do they share it? All prosecutions are publicly available information. It is reported in the media. It's also available in the law reports, which are reported. Insofar as someone has a criminal record in Singapore, I would imagine that access to his records would be available through Interpol. So, there are certain treaties that would allow for countries to cooperate in terms of exchanging information on the criminal records of people in their own countries. There are also mutual assistance treaties that would allow for extradition, for example. Yeah.
Thank you, Gordon. Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, thank you. Well, if you'd like to join me in thanking the panel in respect to this topic, so thank you very much for Jörg, Haya, Hockheim and Hedel. It's now time for lunch, which I believe is in the same place that we had it yesterday. That's the opera room at the top of the stairs. Please ensure that you pick up the available materials outside if you haven't received them already. I'm sure Brian doesn't want to take them back to Las Vegas, so please feel free to take copies. And we're due to come back here at 2 o'clock for the discussion groups. They'll be in 3 different rooms. We're going to have in this room, keeping crime out of gaming, in the Tosca room, which is the other side, promoting a socially responsible industry, and the Carmen room, diversity in gaming. So please have a look again on the website for the discussion points which are there, and please come back, and we look forward to your contributions this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Moderator.